Stop. Where did you learn that melody? A man's voice suddenly rose above the traffic and the footsteps along the sidewalk. Annie froze. She blinked and looked up at the man standing a few feet from her two baskets of flowers. "It isn't really a song, sir," she said. "It's just a melody I've been humming since I was little." Richard Whitmore remained where he stood. One hand tightened around the handle of his umbrella, and his eyes never left her. Behind him, afternoon traffic continued through downtown Philadelphia, horns and engines blending into a restless wall of noise. But Richard no longer seemed to hear any of it. "That melody is very familiar," he said. "Could you sing it again?" Annie glanced at the people passing along the sidewalk, then looked back at him. "You want me to sing it right here?" "Please." She shifted on the stone step outside a closed storefront. Two baskets rested beside her feet, filled with white roses, carnations, and small bundles of late summer daisies. Annie had been walking since morning. The woven handles had left painful red marks across her palms. "Do you like the melody?" she asked. Richard's face tightened. "No," he answered quietly. "I'm afraid I may have heard it wrong." Before Annie could ask what he meant, the black sedan parked at the curb gave a short honk. The driver lowered the passenger side window. "Mr. Whitmore, we should leave. You have a board meeting in 20 minutes. Richard raised one hand without turning around. "Cancel it." The driver stared at him. "Sir, everyone is already waiting." "I said cancel it." After a few seconds of hesitation, the window slowly rose again. Annie studied Richard more carefully. The Whitmore name reminded her of hotels, real estate developments, and business articles she had seen on newsstands. "You're Richard Whitmore?" He nodded. "Yes." Annie's fingers closed unconsciously around the edge of the handkerchief in her coat pocket. "Then why would a man like you stop in the middle of the street because he heard me humming?" Richard looked at the empty space beside her. After a moment, he sat down at the far end of the stone step, leaving several feet between them. "Because I wrote that melody." Annie gave a brief laugh, unable to hide her disbelief. "I don't think so. I wrote it. There are thousands of melodies that sound alike." "Not that one." Annie looked directly at him, waiting for a smile or some sign that this was merely a rich man's attempt to amuse himself. But Richard was completely serious. He spoke more slowly. "The first phrase rises 4 notes. Then it pauses just before the high section. Most people take a breath too early there." Annie's hand slipped away from the handkerchief. Richard continued. "At the end, the melody falls on the second note, then returns to the opening note." Annie said nothing. No one had ever described the melody that way. Margaret had never known where it came from either. Whenever Annie hummed it during the long evenings in their small room, Margaret would say it sounded too sad and tell her to sing something happier. Richard turned the white rose he had just purchased between his fingers. "I never published it," he said. "I never recorded it for anyone outside my family." The air still carried the heat of late summer, yet Annie felt a chill move down her spine. "Maybe I heard someone else sing it." "Who?" "I don't know." "Your mother?" Annie's expression changed. "She died 6 months ago." Richard was silent for a moment. "I'm sorry." His sympathy was brief and direct, without the false tenderness people often used when they did not know what else to say. "Her name was Margaret Doyle," Annie said. "She raised me." "But she almost never sang." Richard looked down at the rose. "Did she ever tell you where you heard that melody?" "No." "Did she ever tell you not to sing it?" Annie frowned. "Why would she do that?" Richard looked away. He seemed to regret the question as soon as he asked it. "I don't know." Annie lifted a carnation from the basket and began adjusting the paper around its stem. "You still haven't told me why the melody matters so much." Richard watched her hands. They were slender, roughened by work, with a faint scar across her right thumb. Something about the way she folded the paper caught his attention, as though he had seen the movement thousands of times but could no longer remember where. "I wrote it many years ago," he said. "For someone in my family." Annie waited. "For my daughter." Only 2 words, yet Richard's voice changed as he said them. Annie's fingers stopped against the paper. Richard looked across the street, where people moved beneath storefront awnings and traffic lights. "She used to ask me to sing the high part again. At first, she could never reach the final note. I told her not to force her voice." Before he could continue, the next sentence suddenly sounded inside Annie's mind. "Let it rise like a bird taking flight," Richard said softly. The carnation slipped from Annie's hand. Richard turned toward her at once. She bent down to retrieve it, but her fingers had suddenly become clumsy. "I've heard that before." Richard leaned toward her. From whom? I don't know. Try to remember. The urgency in his voice made Annie draw back. I told you, I don't know. Richard realized he was pressuring her and immediately straightened. You're right, I'm asking too much. Annie placed the carnation back in the basket. How long has your daughter been missing? Richard looked down at the rose in his hand. 10 years. She turned toward him. How old would she be now? A long silence followed. 18. For one moment, the sounds of the city seemed to recede. Annie became aware of the empty water bottle beside her foot, the flower wrappers warming in the sun, and the man beside her holding the rose as though releasing it would take away the last thing keeping him upright. A thought flashed through her mind and frightened her. She pushed it away immediately. My name is Annie Carter, she said. Before today, I had never heard anything about your family except what people write in the newspapers. Richard studied her face for a long time. Annie, he repeated. Yes. Is that short for another name? No, at least not as far as I know. Richard nodded slowly, but her answer did nothing to ease the tension in his expression. Annie gripped both basket handles. Pain immediately ran through her arms. I should go. I still have to sell the rest of these flowers before dark. Richard stood. How much for all of them? Annie looked at him cautiously. You don't need that many flowers. One of my hotels is hosting a reception tonight. That's convenient. It is very convenient. The corner of Annie's mouth moved slightly, though she still did not know how much she could trust him. There are 32 roses, 20 carnations, and 14 bundles of daisies. Name the price. Annie calculated carefully, then gave him the total. Richard opened his wallet, counted out the exact amount, and handed it to her. Annie checked it twice. No tip, she said. No, Richard replied. The answer made her look up in surprise. Richard signaled for the driver to open the trunk. The man named Daniel stepped out and walked toward the flower baskets. As Annie picked up the final bouquet, the handkerchief slipped from her coat pocket without her noticing. Daniel did not see it either. Richard did. He bent down and picked it up. Several strands of black hair remained caught in the fabric. Miss Carter, he began. At that exact moment, a gust of wind swept Annie's hair aside, exposing the left side of her neck. Richard went still. Just below her ear was a small birthmark shaped like a falling raindrop. His breath stopped. 10 years earlier, he had kissed that exact mark every night. He had held his little daughter in his arms and called her Daddy's little raindrop. Richard's fingers closed around the handkerchief until the fabric wrinkled in his fist. Annie turned back. Did you call me? It took Richard several seconds to force his voice into something steady. I was going to ask where the empty baskets should be returned. Annie took a receipt from the flower shop, wrote an address on the back, and handed it to him. Here. She did not notice that Richard's hand trembled as he accepted it. Annie walked toward the bus stop. Richard remained beside the open trunk, holding the address in one hand and the handkerchief with her strands of hair in the other. Daniel stepped beside him. Do you think she's your daughter? Richard did not answer at once. He watched Annie board the bus. The doors closed. Through the window, she found a seat and rested her exhausted hands on her knees. I spent 10 years preparing myself for the moment I found her, Richard said. I used to believe that if the day ever came, I wouldn't need any more proof. The bus pulled away. Richard looked down at the handkerchief. Call the laboratory, he said. Tonight. Daniel made the call before the sedan had even pulled away from the curb. Richard sat motionless in the back seat. Annie's handkerchief had been placed inside a clean envelope and carefully sealed. Resting on his knee was the receipt with her address written in small, neat handwriting. Daniel ended the call and turned back toward him. The laboratory can accept the sample tonight, but they'll need a reference sample from you. How long until we have the results? They said they should have a preliminary result by tomorrow afternoon. Richard looked out the window. The streets of Philadelphia passed one after another, but he did not truly see any of them. Make sure no one outside the laboratory sees her name. I used a case number. Good. The driver glanced at him through the rearview mirror. Mr. Whitmore, should I take you home? Richard looked toward the trunk behind them, where Annie's flower baskets had been packed tightly together. First, go to the Franklin Hotel. Tell the manager to place the flowers in the lobby and the dining room. Daniel turned slightly. The hotel isn't hosting a reception tonight. It is now. The driver gave a faint smile and changed direction toward downtown. When the sedan stopped in front of the Franklin Hotel, several employees immediately hurried outside. They recognized Richard's car before the driver had even opened the door. Richard stepped out and personally inspected each basket before handing them over to the manager. "Handle them carefully," he said, "especially the white roses." The manager looked at the flowers, then opened his ledger. "Which account should the expense be charged to, sir?" Richard handed him the receipt Annie had written. "Record the entire amount as a purchase from a local vendor. Keep her name on it." The manager looked down at the name Annie Carter. He appeared slightly surprised, but he asked no questions. When Richard returned to the car, Daniel watched him for a moment before speaking. "You could help her directly. I bought all her flowers. You know what I mean." Richard folded the receipt, then opened it again almost immediately. "She would refuse." "Maybe. She has pride." Daniel shook his head slightly. "No, dignity." Richard was silent for a moment, then nodded. "Dignity." The laboratory received them through a private entrance at the rear of the building. A technician in a white coat led Richard into a collection room. He provided a cheek swab while Daniel completed the paperwork under the registered case number. The technician lifted the envelope containing the handkerchief and examined the seal carefully. "I need to be clear that the material on the fabric may not be sufficient," she said. "If we find intact cells, we can attempt a comparison, but the result will only be preliminary." "I understand." For an official conclusion, the young woman would need to consent and provide a sample herself. Richard looked at the envelope. "I understand. There is also a possibility that the handkerchief contains biological material from more than one person. Do whatever you can." His voice remained calm. Only the hand resting on the edge of the table betrayed him. It had not stopped trembling since the moment he saw the birthmark beneath Annie's ear. When Richard returned home, Martha Bell was waiting near the entrance. She had worked for the Whitmore family for more than 25 years. During that time, she had learned how to recognize when Richard was worried about business and when the pain came from somewhere much deeper. "You missed dinner," she said. "I'm not hungry. That has never stopped me from putting food on the table." Martha followed him into the study carrying a tray with chicken, soup, bread, and hot coffee. Richard placed Annie's receipt on the desk. Martha noticed the name written on the back. "Who is Annie Carter?" Richard removed his coat but remained standing. "A flower seller. That answer does not explain why you look as though you have just seen someone return from the dead." Richard looked up at her. "She knows the lullaby." Martha's hand stopped in midair above the coffee cup. "What do you mean she knows it?" "She sang it on the street. Every note. Even the change, just before the ending." Martha slowly set the cup down. "Did you speak to her?" "Yes." "And?" "Her name is Annie. She is the right age." Richard paused. "She has a birthmark just below her left ear." Martha placed one hand on the edge of the desk. "Shaped like a raindrop?" Richard nodded. Neither of them spoke for several seconds. Martha slowly sat in the chair across from him. "You already ordered a test. The laboratory is working on it. Does she know?" "No." Martha's expression hardened immediately. "Richard, I needed to know before I said anything. You took a sample without asking her. She dropped the handkerchief. That does not answer my question." Richard looked away. No, she did not give permission. Martha had never been intimidated by his power or his wealth. Whenever Richard was wrong, she was always the first person to tell him directly. "You may have had a reason," she said, "but do not turn that reason into the right to make decisions for someone else." "I know. Do you really?" Richard pulled out a chair and sat down. All his strength seemed to leave him at once. "If I tell her what I suspect and the result proves me wrong, I will place 10 years of my grief on the shoulders of a stranger." Martha looked at him without blinking. "And if you are right, then the first decision you make after finding your daughter will be one that takes away her right to choose." Richard ran his thumb along the edge of the receipt. "What would you do if you were me?" "I would be afraid too." Martha's voice softened, but it did not lose its firmness. "But fear does not make a wrong choice harmless." Richard accepted her words in silence. He did not defend himself. He did not argue. Martha pushed the bowl of soup toward him. "Eat." "I can't." "You can. You simply do not want to." Richard picked up the spoon because arguing with her required more energy than he had left. Martha waited until he had managed several spoonfuls before asking, "Where does she live?" Richard handed her the receipt. Martha read the address and frowned. "That neighborhood has changed a great deal. She lives above an old storefront. Alone, the woman who raised her, died 6 months ago." Martha set the receipt down gently, as though even the ink might be fragile. "Did she say anything about her life before she lived with that woman?" "No. She only said she has always remembered the melody." Memories sometimes lock themselves away when a person is too young to survive what happened. Richard looked toward the family photograph on the bookshelf. Monica stood beside him in the picture, one hand resting on her husband's arm. Between them was an emptiness no frame could ever fill. He did not allow himself to look for long. What if she refuses to see me? Then you respect that. What if she believes I abandoned her? Then you tell her the truth. What if the truth is still not enough? Martha looked at him with the eyes of someone who had watched him search for 10 years and had also watched him punish himself every day. The truth is not a payment, Richard. You cannot place it on a table and expect every debt to disappear at once. Richard lowered his eyes to the bowl of soup. Near midnight, Daniel called. The laboratory found usable material, he said. The comparison is underway. When will we know? Tomorrow afternoon. Possibly sooner. Richard ended the call and went upstairs. He stopped in front of the closed bedroom door at the end of the hallway. The room had not changed in 10 years. No one had been allowed to move the small bed. No one had been allowed to remove the stuffed animals. No one had been allowed to touch the music box on the table beside the window. Richard reached toward the doorknob, but he did not open the door. He simply stood there, listening as the house slowly fell into silence around him, as though a little girl were still sleeping on the other side and all he had to do was wait until morning to hear her call for him. Across the city, Annie climbed the narrow staircase to her apartment. In her hands were an empty water bottle and the money from the flowers. Mrs. Jenkins opened her door when she heard Annie's footsteps passing by. You sold all of them? One man bought everything. He must have been someone special. He was strange. Generous strange or dangerous strange? Annie thought for several seconds. Said strange. Mrs. Jenkins stepped into the hallway. Have you eaten? Not really. I made baked pasta. Take some before you convince yourself again that a few cookies count as dinner. Annie smiled and accepted the covered plate. Inside the apartment, she placed the money into an envelope marked rent. She should have felt relieved. The flowers were gone. The rent money was there. The next day would be a little less difficult, but all she could think about was Richard's expression and the way his face had changed when he heard her humming. Annie warmed the food, sat at the small kitchen table, and tried to think about the next day's work. A few minutes later, she realized she was humming again. She stopped immediately. The melody broke off halfway through. The final note remained inside her mind, waiting quietly like a door she did not yet know how to open. The following afternoon, Richard was leading a meeting when Daniel walked straight into the room without knocking. The moment Richard saw his face, he stood abruptly. The results are here, Daniel said. Richard turned toward the people seated around the table. Leave. No one asked a question. Within seconds, the room was empty. Richard closed the door. Daniel handed him a sealed envelope. This is still only a preliminary result, just as the laboratory warned. Richard took the envelope. His fingers no longer seemed to obey him. He broke the seal, removed the report, and scanned the case number, the genetic markers, and the technical language he could not understand in that moment. His eyes stopped at the conclusion. Probability of paternity, 99.9%. The room went completely silent. Richard read it again, then one more time. His hand tightened around the report until the edge of the paper creased. Daniel said quietly, Richard? He did not answer. In his mind, he saw a young woman sitting on a stone step beside two baskets of flowers. Her hands were marked red by the woven handles. Her black hair had been swept aside by the wind. That melody had risen above the noise of the street, still whole after 10 years. 10 years of searching. 10 years of opening doors and walking away empty-handed. 10 years of wondering whether she was cold, whether she was hungry, whether she still remembered her father's name. And then he had found her on a sidewalk, selling flowers to strangers so she could pay the rent. Richard slowly lowered himself into the nearest chair. The report still trembled in his hand. She's alive, he said. If Richard's words, she's alive, touched your heart, please like this video, comment where you are watching from, and subscribe to the channel for more emotional stories. Richard remained seated for a long time after Daniel quietly left. Probability of paternity, 99.9%. He reached for his phone, then stopped. 10 years. He had imagined this moment in countless ways. In every version, he would know exactly what to say. Instead, every sentence sounded wrong. Daniel knocked lightly before stepping back inside. What now? Richard folded the report with care. Now, I do the hardest part. You tell her? I ask if she'll let me. Daniel nodded. That's different. It has to be. Richard stood and walked toward the window overlooking the city. Thousands of people crossed the sidewalks below, each carrying plans for the evening. Somewhere among them, Annie was probably arranging flowers for another day of work, unaware that her life had already changed. She doesn't owe me trust, Richard said. No, she doesn't owe me forgiveness. No, but she deserves the truth. Daniel waited before speaking again. Will you bring security? No. The media follows you almost everywhere. Then they won't follow me tomorrow. You're canceling your schedule again? Yes. Daniel smiled faintly. Your board won't like it. My board can wait. Late that afternoon, Richard stopped at a neighborhood bakery a few blocks from Annie's apartment. The smell of fresh bread drifted through the open door. The owner, an elderly woman arranging cinnamon rolls behind the counter, looked up. Can I help you? Yes, I'd like 2 apple pies. Fresh out of the oven. I'll take both. And coffee? Richard hesitated. Yes, 2 coffees. He paid, thanked her, and carried the boxes himself. Daniel looked at him as they returned to the car. You're bringing pie? She sells flowers. Daniel raised an eyebrow. I don't think expensive gifts belong in a first conversation. That, Daniel said, is probably the first normal idea you've had in 2 days. Richard almost smiled. The neighborhood looked different in daylight than it had on the receipt. Brick buildings stood shoulder to shoulder. Laundry moved gently from several balconies. An older couple watered flower boxes outside their apartment while greeting everyone who passed. The sedan stopped across the street. Richard remained inside for nearly a minute. You've negotiated billion-dollar contracts, Daniel said. I know. You're afraid of knocking on one apartment door. Richard looked toward the second-floor window. I've never had more to lose. He crossed the street carrying the bakery box and the coffee. Mrs. Jenkins was sweeping the front steps. She examined him for a second before recognition appeared. You're that man who bought all Annie's flowers. I am. You're back. Yes, ma'am. She leaned on the broom. Most people don't come back around here unless they forgot something. I believe I did. What would that be? A conversation? Mrs. Jenkins studied his face longer than was comfortable. You planning to upset that girl? No. You sure? I hope not. She pointed toward the staircase. She just got home. Thank you. And Mr. Whitmore? Richard turned. If she's not ready to hear whatever you're bringing, don't push. I won't. He climbed the narrow wooden stairs and stopped outside apartment 2B. For the first time in years, his hand hesitated before knocking. A few moments later, the door opened. Annie looked surprised. You? Yes. She noticed the pie boxes first. Did the hotel not like the flowers? They loved them. Then why are you here? Richard lifted the bakery bag awkwardly. I thought we might talk. You brought pie. I wasn't sure what else to bring. Annie folded her arms. You could have brought an explanation. I did. He held up the sealed envelope. Her expression became guarded again. I don't want money. This isn't money. I don't want charity either. Neither do I. She looked at the envelope without taking it. What is it? The answer to a question I couldn't ignore. Silence settled between them. Finally, Annie stepped aside just enough for him to enter the small apartment. It'll only be a few minutes, she said. Thank you. The apartment was neat despite its age. A small table stood beside the kitchen window. Several books rested on a shelf beside fresh flowers Annie had kept for herself because no customer had chosen them. Richard placed the pie on the table. You really didn't have to buy this. I know. She remained standing. Richard did the same. I owe you an apology before anything else. She waited. I used the handkerchief you dropped. I guessed that. You were right to be angry. You didn't even ask. No. You decided for me. Yes. She looked away. For 10 years, Richard continued quietly. I've searched for someone I thought I'd never see again. When I heard you sing, I made a decision out of fear. That doesn't make it right. No. His answer came so quickly that Annie looked back at him. I won't defend it. The tension eased, if only slightly. She nodded toward the envelope. So what's inside? Richard held it but did not move closer. A laboratory compared my DNA with the sample from your handkerchief. My handkerchief, Annie repeated. Yes. And? His voice became almost unsteady. The result says there's a 99.9% probability that I'm your biological father. The room became very still. Annie blinked once. Then again. A short laugh escaped before she could stop it. No. Richard said nothing. She shook her head. No, that's impossible. I understand why you'd think so. My father. She stopped because she had never actually known what to call the man who had never been part of her life. You're mistaken. I wanted to be. She stared at him. You expect me to believe that yesterday I was selling flowers and today you're telling me I'm your daughter? I don't expect you to believe anything immediately. This has to be the wrong person. It may feel that way. It is that way. Richard slowly extended the envelope. You don't have to read it now. She didn't reach for it. You can throw it away if you choose. You're serious. I've never been more serious. Annie searched his face for any hint of deception. Instead, she found something she hadn't expected. Fear. Not fear of losing money. Not fear of scandal. Fear that she might close the door before he had the chance to tell her everything. After several long seconds, Annie finally accepted the envelope. She did not open it. Not yet. She simply held it against her chest while looking at the stranger who claimed to be the father she had spent her entire life believing she would never meet. Richard drew a slow breath. There is much more you deserve to know, he said softly. But I'll only tell you when you're ready to ask. Richard did not move after speaking. He understood that silence belonged to Annie now. She looked down at the sealed envelope resting in her hands. The laboratory logo in the corner seemed strangely ordinary for something that claimed to answer the question she had never dared ask herself. Finally, she looked up. You expect me to believe a sheet of paper more than the life I've lived? No. Then what do you expect? Only that you'll let me answer your questions. Annie gave a quiet, uncertain laugh. I don't even know which question to ask first. Richard nodded. That's fair. She walked to the kitchen table and placed the envelope beside the pie he had brought. Neither of them reached for the food. You said, you're my father. I said the test strongly suggests that I am. And if you're wrong, then I'll apologize for turning your life upside down. And if you're right, Richard lowered his eyes for a moment. Then I've already missed 10 years I can never get back. The honesty in his voice unsettled her more than confidence would have. She pulled out a chair but remained standing behind it. My mother never mentioned you. You knew Margaret as your mother. I did. I'm not talking about Margaret. Annie frowned. What do you mean? Richard took a slow breath. The woman who gave birth to you was named Monica. The name meant nothing. Annie searched her memory and found only empty space. I've never heard that name. I thought you might not have. You knew her? I loved her. His answer came so naturally that Annie looked away. You keep saying things that sound impossible. I know. My whole life I've been Annie Carter. You are Annie. And suddenly you're telling me I had another name. Richard reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. I brought something else. He carefully removed an old photograph protected inside a clear sleeve. I'm only asking you to look. Annie hesitated before taking it. A smiling black woman stood beside a white man in front of a small music hall. Between them stood a young girl with dark curls. The girl's face was turned toward the camera. Annie's breathing slowed. She lifted the photograph closer. The little girl's smile, the shape of her eyes, the slight curve of her chin. She had seen that face every morning in the bathroom mirror. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the sleeve. Who is she? Richard answered softly. Our daughter. Annie continued looking. And this woman? Monica. She compared the woman's face with her own. There were similarities she could not ignore. Not enough to convince her. Enough to make certainty impossible. She returned the photograph. Pictures can look alike. They can. People tell strangers they resemble someone all the time. They do. You keep agreeing with everything I say. Because most of what you're feeling makes sense. She looked at him again. You aren't arguing. I'm trying not to. Why? Because this isn't about winning. Before Annie could answer, someone knocked lightly on the open apartment door. Mrs. Jenkins leaned inside holding a casserole dish. I made too much meatloaf again. She stopped when she noticed Richard. Oh. Annie quickly took the dish. Thank you. Mrs. Jenkins looked from Annie to Richard. Everything all right? Annie hesitated. I'm not sure. Mrs. Jenkins nodded with understanding. I'll be downstairs if you need me. After she left, Annie set the dish on the counter. You know, she said quietly. She checks on everyone in this building. Richard smiled faintly. She checked on you yesterday too. She thinks you're either a gentleman or a problem. And which one am I? I haven't decided. For the first time, Richard almost laughed. I suppose that's reasonable. Annie finally opened the envelope. She read every line carefully. The scientific language meant little. The conclusion did not. She reached the last page and stopped. 99.9%. She read it again, then a third time. It says probable. Yes. It doesn't say certain. No test can use that word. She folded the papers with careful hands. If this is true, Richard waited. Why didn't you find me? The question landed harder than any accusation. He did not rush to answer. I searched. For how long? 10 years. And you never found me? No. I was living less than 2 hours away. I didn't know. She looked toward the window. I sold flowers every week. I know. I rode the same bus. I know. You have investigators, lawyers, money. Her voice grew quieter, and I was still invisible. Richard closed his eyes briefly. I have asked myself that every day. Annie wanted to stay angry. Instead, she saw something unexpected. He wasn't making excuses. He looked like a man who had already asked himself every question she was asking now. She sat down at last. My head hurts. Richard remained standing. Would you like me to leave? She didn't answer immediately. No. The word surprised both of them. She searched for the right sentence. I need someone to explain how a person wakes up one morning believing one life and goes to sleep wondering if every memory has the wrong name. Richard pulled out the chair across from her but waited. She nodded. He sat without moving any closer. The first thing you should know, he said gently, is that nothing good Margaret did for you disappears because we discovered the truth. Annie looked up, and nothing painful disappears either. She swallowed. I don't want to hate her. I'm not asking you to. I don't want to stop loving her. You don't have to. A tear rolled slowly down her cheek before she realized she was crying. Richard instinctively reached forward, then stopped himself halfway. Instead, he quietly slid the box of tissues across the table. Annie accepted one. Neither of them spoke for several moments. When she finally broke the silence, her voice was barely above a whisper. If I agree to keep listening, Richard met her eyes. Will you tell me everything? I will. Even the parts that make you look bad? He answered without hesitation. Especially those. Richard folded his hands on the table. He had spent years answering questions from investors, reporters, and attorneys. But Annie's request demanded a different kind of honesty. 10 years ago, he began, you went to Fairmount Park with Monica. Annie pressed the tissue between her fingers. You weren't there? No. I was in Chicago for a hotel meeting. You chose a meeting over us? The question came quickly, and Richard did not avoid it. I believed I would be home that night. I thought there would always be another afternoon, another dinner, another chance to keep a promise. That isn't an answer. No, I chose work. I told myself it was for my family, but that does not change where I was. Annie's eyes remained on him. Go on. Monica took you to the park after lunch. It was crowded. There was a street fair nearby, and several entrances were open. At some point, she lost sight of you. For how long? Less than 5 minutes. Annie looked toward the kitchen window. 5 minutes changed 10 years. Yes. What happened next? Monica called the police. Park employees closed the main gates. Volunteers searched the paths, restrooms, parking areas, and nearby streets. By evening, your photograph was on every local station. Did anyone see me leave? One person remembered a woman walking near the side entrance with a girl who matched your description. But the account was uncertain. We spent years following reports that led nowhere. Annie glanced at the photograph on the table. And you blamed Monica. Richard did not ask how she knew. Yes. Did you say it to her? Not directly at first. I did something worse. I became cold. Every time she spoke about hope, I answered with plans. Every time she needed comfort, I called another investigator. That sounds like avoiding her. It was. Why? Because if I admitted she had only looked away for a moment, then I had to accept that this could have happened to either of us. Blaming her gave me somewhere to put my anger. Annie's mouth tightened. She lost me too. I know that now. You should have known it then. I should have. The answer left no room for argument, and that seemed to frustrate her more. Did she forgive you? Richard looked down at the untouched pie. I don't know. You were married. That does not mean I understood everything she carried. When did she die? 3 years ago. Annie's face changed. You said she kept searching. She did. Until the end? Yes. Richard or me. You don't have to accept the first test, he said. You can choose this clinic or any other place. Daniel will arrange payment without giving me access to your medical records. The result can go directly to you. Annie picked up the card. You think another test will make this easier? No. I think it will make the answer yours. She turned the card over. And after that? That depends on you. You won't expect me to move into your house? No. Change my name? No. Stand beside you for reporters? Not unless you choose to. Take your money? Richard paused. I would like to help. That wasn't my question. No. I will not require you to take anything. Annie placed the card beside the report. You're used to people saying yes. I am. And if I say no, I will still answer when you call. What if I never call? His jaw tightened, though his voice stayed even. Then I will respect it. She did not entirely believe him, but he had not tried to move closer or touch her. Even the pie sat unopened, as if he understood that ordinary gestures could feel like pressure when they came from a man with so much more than she had. A knock sounded at the door. Mrs. Jenkins entered after Annie called out. She carried 2 forks and looked at the pie. I figured neither of you remembered plates. Annie wiped her face. We're not hungry. Mrs. Jenkins set the forks down. People say that right before they make bad decisions on an empty stomach. Richard stood. Mrs. Jenkins, would you like some? I brought the forks, didn't I? Annie gave her a tired look, but Mrs. Jenkins had already opened the box. They ate at the small table, though Richard managed only a few bites. Mrs. Jenkins did not ask what they had been discussing. She spoke instead about a broken washing machine in the basement and the landlord's habit of promising repairs on Fridays so no one could reach him over the weekend. The normal conversation allowed Annie to breathe. When Mrs. Jenkins left, Richard noticed several boxes stacked near the bedroom door. Were those Margaret's? Annie followed his gaze. Her clothes, papers, some things from the hospital. I haven't sorted them. Would you like help? She almost refused. Then she looked at the boxes again. Not today. Whenever you decide. Richard rose and placed his coffee cup in the sink. Annie watched him rinse it. You don't have to do that. I used it. That has probably never mattered in your house. It matters here. He dried the cup with the towel beside the sink and set it down. At the door, he stopped. There is one more thing. Annie waited. Your name at birth was Annabelle. She showed no recognition. Monica called you Annie from the day you came home from the hospital. You refused to answer to Annabelle unless you were angry with us. Why Carter? It was Monica's last name before we married. Annie looked toward the papers on the table. Margaret had not chosen a random name. She had known enough to preserve part of the truth while hiding the rest. Richard read the realization on her face. You think she knew who I was? I don't know what she knew, but Carter means she knew something. Yes. Annie crossed her arms, suddenly cold despite the warm apartment. Richard opened the door. I'll wait for you to contact me. Richard. He turned. It was the first time she had used his name. Tomorrow, Annie said, glancing at the boxes. I'm going through Margaret's things. He waited without assuming an invitation. If you want the truth, she continued. You can come at 10. I'll be here. No lawyers. No lawyers. No security. Daniel will wait outside. And don't bring anything. Richard glanced at the half-eaten pie. Not even breakfast? Annie considered him for a moment. Coffee, she said. Just coffee. The corner of his mouth lifted. How do you take it? 2 sugars. Richard nodded, then walked down the stairs. Annie closed the door and returned to the table. The apartment looked the same as it had that morning, yet every object now seemed capable of hiding an answer. She picked up Monica's photograph and carried it to the bedroom. The first box held sweaters, receipts, and folded scarves. Beneath them lay a large brown envelope with Annie's name written across the front in Margaret's handwriting. Annie sat on the edge of the bed. She touched the seal but did not open it. Not yet. On the other side of the door, Tomorrow waited with coffee, questions, and whatever Margaret had been too afraid to say while she was alive. At 10 the next morning, Richard arrived carrying 2 coffees and nothing else. Mrs. Jenkins met him on the stairs. You remembered the sugar? 2 packets. She'll notice if you didn't. I've been warned. Annie opened the door before he knocked. She had tied her hair away from her face, and several boxes were already arranged around the kitchen table. The brown envelope sat in the center. You're on time, she said. I didn't want to give you another reason not to trust me. That list is already long enough. Richard accepted the remark without complaint and handed her the coffee. Annie checked the label. 2 sugars. I listen sometimes. Let's see how long that lasts. Daniel waited in the car as agreed. Richard removed his coat and placed it over the back of a chair. He noticed the envelope but did not ask Annie to open it. She sat across from him. I found this last night. Richard read his daughter's current name in Margaret's handwriting. Did you look inside? No. Why not? Because once I open it, I can't pretend she might have had a good explanation. Richard wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. There may not be one. I know. You don't have to read it with me here. Annie touched the corner of the envelope. I asked you to come because if it says what I think it says, I don't want to be alone. Richard nodded. Then I'll stay. She broke the seal. Inside were several folded papers, a newspaper clipping, a hospital bracelet, and a small piece of pale yellow fabric. Annie set each object on the table. The newspaper had been folded twice. When she opened it, she found a photograph of herself with shorter curls and a wide smile. Richard and Monica appeared beside the picture in smaller images. The headline read, 10-year, old Annabelle, Whitmore missing from Fairmount Park. Annie's fingers stopped on the date. It was 10 years ago. Yes. She read the first paragraphs without speaking. The article described the search, the public appeal, and the reward offered for information. It included the clothes she had been wearing and the teardrop-shaped mark on her neck. Annie turned the paper over. On the back, Margaret had written one sentence in blue ink. I only wanted to keep her safe. Annie pushed the clipping away. Safe from whom? Richard's expression tightened. I don't know. From you? No. You can't know what she believed. That's true. Annie picked up the hospital bracelet. The printed name had faded, but it remained readable. Annabelle M. Whitmore. She held it against her wrist. It was too small now, yet a faint pressure settled around her skin as if some part of her remembered wearing it. The piece of yellow fabric came from a dress. 2 initials had been sewn near the edge. Ah, ve. Richard recognized it. Monica made that dress. Annie lowered the fabric. You're sure? She sewed the initials herself. She said store labels came loose too easily. Annie reached for the first letter. The handwriting began neatly. Annie. I have written this many times and destroyed every version. I kept telling myself I would explain when you were older, when I was stronger, when there was enough money to survive what would happen next. Annie paused. Richard said nothing. She continued. The day I found you, I was not well. I believed something that was not true. For a brief time, I thought you had been sent to me. When I understood what I had done, your face was already on television. I knew I should take you back. I packed your clothes twice. Each time, fear stopped me. Annie placed the page down. She knew. Richard's voice remained low. Yes, she knew from the beginning. Not from the first moment, but soon after. That doesn't make it better. No. Annie rose and walked to the sink, still holding the letter. She watched the news. She saw you asking for me. She saw Monica. Richard stayed in his chair. She could have called, Annie said. She didn't even have to give her name. No. She could have left me at a police station. Yes. She could have done one decent thing. Her voice broke on the final word. Richard stood but kept his distance. You don't have to finish today. I do. She returned to the table and unfolded the next sheet. Margaret described leaving Philadelphia, changing apartments, and avoiding places where Annie might see old photographs. She admitted telling Annie that early memories were dreams. She had chosen Carter after hearing the name on a television interview with Monica. Annie looked toward Richard. She took my mother's name. She may have thought it would help you keep part of yourself, or it helped her feel less guilty. That may also be true. Annie read the final page. Your name was Annabelle Whitmore. Monica gave birth to you. Richard Whitmore is your father. They did not abandon you. I took 10 years from your family because I was afraid to lose the person I had come to love. I cared for you, but care does not change what I did. I am sorry that I left you with the truth after leaving you alone. Annie lowered the letter. For several moments, she sat without moving. Then she pressed both hands against her forehead. She knew she was dying. Yes. She still waited until after. Richard pulled the tissue box closer but did not touch her. Annie looked at him through tears. I paid her hospital bills. I missed work to take her to appointments. I sat beside her every night. You cared for the woman you believed was your mother, and she let me. That was her failure, not yours. Annie shook her head. I loved her. I know. I still love her. Richard's eyes filled, though his voice stayed steady. You are allowed to. How can you say that after what she took from you? Because asking you to hate her would take something else from you. Annie covered her mouth and cried. Richard waited until she reached toward him first. She did not ask for an embrace. She caught the sleeve of his shirt and held it as if she needed proof that someone would remain seated beside her. Richard placed his hand on the table near hers. After a while, Annie spoke. I want to see the house. Richard looked at her. Not because I'm accepting everything, she added. I want to know whether anything there feels real. You choose the day. Tomorrow. I'll arrange it. No reporters, no lawyers, no gifts. Agreed. And I leave when I say. Richard nodded. Whenever you say. Annie released his sleeve and folded Margaret's letter along its old creases. On the table, 2 names rested beside each other, Annie Carter and Annabelle Whitmore. By the next morning, she would enter the house where one of them had vanished and discover whether the other had ever truly left. The following morning, Annie stood outside her building before Richard's car arrived. She had changed clothes 3 times and finally chosen dark jeans, a plain cream blouse, and the only jacket she owned that did not show signs of wear at the cuffs. Mrs. Jenkins watched from the front steps with a mug of coffee in both hands. You don't have to look like anybody but yourself, she said. I know. Then stop pulling at that sleeve. Annie let go of it. A gray sedan turned onto the street and stopped near the curb. Daniel got out and opened the rear door. But Annie shook her head. I'll sit in front. Of course, he said. Richard was already seated in the back. He had followed every condition she set. There were no other cars, no cameras, no boxes wrapped with ribbons. Good morning, he said. Morning. Annie fastened her seatbelt and looked through the windshield. Mrs. Jenkins called from the steps. Have her back before dark. Richard leaned forward so she could hear him. Yes, ma'am. Mrs. Jenkins nodded once, satisfied. The drive took them away from Annie's narrow block and through neighborhoods where brick row houses gradually gave way to wider streets and old trees. Richard did not fill the ride with explanations. He answered when Annie asked a question and stayed quiet when she turned toward the window. After 20 minutes, she glanced back at him. Do you always have someone drive you? Most days. Why not today? I thought arriving with a line of cars would make this harder. It would. Daniel kept his eyes on the road. He argued about it for 15 minutes. Richard looked at him. That was unnecessary. It was accurate. Annie almost smiled. The estate stood beyond a low stone wall outside the city. The house was large, but it did not look new. Ivy covered part of the brick, and several tall windows faced a broad lawn. Annie expected guards at the entrance. Instead, an older man in work clothes raised one hand as they passed. Richard returned the greeting. Who is he? Annie asked. Mr. Alvarez. He has cared for the grounds for 22 years. He knows I'm coming? He knows a guest is coming. You didn't tell everyone? No. Daniel stopped near the side entrance instead of the main steps. Annie noticed. Why here? This is the door we use every day, Richard said. The front entrance is mostly for formal events. She appreciated the choice, though she did not say so. A woman waited inside. She wore a dark blue dress and held her hands together at her waist. Her silver-streaked hair was pinned neatly, and her expression changed the moment Annie entered. Richard stepped aside. Annie, this is Martha Bell. Martha has been with our family for a long time. Martha did not rush forward. Good morning, Miss Carter. Annie had prepared herself for tears, embraces, and people calling her by another name. The calm greeting gave her room to breathe. Good morning. I made lunch, Martha said. Nothing formal. Mr. Whitmore forgets that food does not need a meeting agenda. Richard removed his coat. I do not do that. You scheduled breakfast last Tuesday. Daniel coughed to hide a laugh. Martha turned back to Annie. Would you like tea, coffee, or water? Water, please. With ice? Yes, ma'am. Martha gave her a small smile. You still say ma'am when you're nervous. Annie stiffened. Martha immediately softened her tone. Forgive me. I won't make a habit of telling you who you used to be. Thank you. They entered a sitting area near the kitchen. Annie expected delicate furniture no one was allowed to touch. But the sofa showed years of use, and a folded newspaper lay beside a pair of reading glasses. A bowl of sugar cubes sat on a side table. Annie looked at it longer than she intended. Martha noticed but said nothing. Richard offered to show her the house. Annie shook her head. "Can we eat first?" Of course." Lunch was tomato soup, grilled cheese sandwiches, and apple slices. Annie looked at the simple meal. "This is what you serve guests?" Martha set down the soup. "This is what I serve people who need to eat." Richard took his seat across from Annie. She tasted the soup and stopped with the spoon halfway to the bowl. "Cinnamon?" "Just a little," Martha said. Annie took another spoonful. "Margaret made it this way." Martha's eyes moved briefly toward Richard. Monica did too. The answer unsettled Annie, but not enough to make her stop eating. Halfway through lunch, she reached for a sugar cube without thinking. She held it between her fingers, then noticed everyone had become attentive. "What?" Martha looked at the cube. "Nothing." "That isn't true." Martha sat beside her. "You used to hide those in your pockets." Annie glanced down at her jacket. "For what?" "You said they were for later. We usually found them in the laundry." Richard's mouth moved into a restrained smile. "You blamed the dog." Annie answered before considering the words. "He couldn't defend himself." The sugar cube slipped from her fingers and landed beside the cup. No one spoke. Annie looked from Martha to Richard. "How did I know that?" Richard's voice remained gentle. "Because you said it many times." "I don't remember saying it." "You may not remember everything at once." She pushed her chair back, needing distance from the table. Martha rose. "There's no hurry. It feels like everyone here knows me except me." Richard stood but did not approach. "Then we stop." Annie looked toward the hallway. Something about the curve of the staircase troubled her. She could not identify why. The smell of lemon furniture polish mixed with cinnamon from the kitchen, and a pressure began behind her eyes. "I want to see more," she said. Richard studied her face. "Are you sure?" "No, but I still want to." They walked through the lower floor. Richard gave only brief explanations. A library, Monica's former music room, a small sunroom facing the garden. Annie paused at the entrance to the music room. A piano stood near the far wall. She did not go inside. Instead, she turned toward the staircase. "What's upstairs?" Richard's expression changed. "Bedrooms." "Mine?" "Yes." The word made her grip the railing. They climbed slowly. At the top, Annie turned left without asking which way to go. Richard and Martha exchanged a glance behind her. She walked past two closed doors and stopped at the end of the hall. Her hand hovered near the brass knob. "This one." Richard came no closer. "Yes." Annie looked at him. "Has anyone changed it?" "No." "For 10 years?" "No." "Why?" Richard lowered his voice. "Because moving anything felt like admitting you would never return." Annie faced the door again. She expected no memory, no recognition, nothing but furniture from a life described by strangers. Yet her hand shook before it touched the knob. "Will you open it?" she asked. Richard stepped forward, then stopped beside her. He placed his hand on the knob but waited. Annie nodded. Richard opened the door, and Annie entered the room that had been waiting for her for 10 years. The room was smaller than Annie expected. Pale yellow walls surrounded a narrow bed, a wooden desk, and a child-sized piano near the window. Faded stars still clung to the ceiling. A stuffed rabbit rested against the pillow, one ear stitched with blue thread. Annie remained near the doorway. Richard stood beside her but did not speak. She looked at the rabbit. "Why is the ear a different color?" "You tore it on the garden fence," Martha said from the hall. "You refused to let me replace it, so Monica repaired it with the only thread she could find." Annie crossed the room and picked up the rabbit. Her thumb found the rough stitches without searching. "Blue," she said. Martha nodded. "You said it made him look brave." Annie turned the toy in her hands. No clear picture came to her, only a sense that the repaired ear had once mattered. Richard watched her face. "Do you want us to leave?" "No." She placed the rabbit back on the bed and moved toward the desk. Colored pencils sat inside a chipped mug. A drawing lay beneath a clear cover. 3 figures holding hands in front of a house. One figure had dark curls, another wore a blue dress, and the tallest had been given arms that reached almost to his knees. Annie touched the edge of the paper. "You drew that," Richard said. "I wasn't very good." "You were 10. She looked at him. "That isn't much of a defense." A quiet laugh escaped Martha before she covered it with her hand. Richard's expression softened. "You used to say the same thing." Annie stepped away from the desk. Every object seemed to carry a story she could not reach. She found books with her name written inside, a pair of red rain boots, and a music notebook filled with uneven notes. The handwriting looked unfamiliar, yet her fingers followed the marks as though expecting them to move. Then she noticed the piano. It had only 4 octaves and several keys had yellowed. A small bench stood beneath it. Annie approached slowly. Richard remained near the door. "Did I play? You were learning. Was I good? You were impatient. That sounds more believable." She sat and pressed one key. The note was slightly flat. Martha said, "It hasn't been tuned in years." Annie rested both hands above the keys. She did not know what she intended to play. Her fingers lowered on their own. 3 notes. She stopped. Richard's face changed. Annie looked at him. "What? Play them again." She did. The notes were the beginning of the melody she had hummed on the street. A pressure formed in her chest. She added a 4th note, then a 5th. Her right hand knew where to move even while her mind insisted she had never sat at this piano. Richard came closer but stopped beside the bench. "May I?" Annie moved slightly to make room. He sat, careful not to touch her. His left hand found the lower keys and supplied a quiet harmony. Annie continued the melody. At first, she followed instinct. Then an image came without warning. Rain against a window. Monica standing near the doorway. Richard seated beside her and counting softly. The image disappeared before Annie could hold it. Her fingers slipped. Richard stopped playing. "I saw something." "What did you see?" "I don't know." "Rain. Someone standing there." He looked toward the doorway. Monica often listened from that spot. Annie pressed her palms together. "I heard you say something." Richard waited. "Something about a bird." His voice became unsteady. "I told you not to force the high note. I said to let it rise like a bird." Annie looked at the keys. "That's why I knew the technique." "Yes." She tried the final passage again. Her voice joined the piano. Quiet at first, then clearer as the notes climbed. Richard followed her pace. When she reached the highest point, the sound came without strain. They stopped together. Annie wiped her cheek with the back of her hand. Richard kept his eyes on the keys. "You always said you would sing it higher than I could." "That sounds like me?" "It does." She studied him. "You remember everything." "Not everything. Enough to regret what I missed." Annie stood and moved toward the window. The garden below looked familiar only in pieces. The line of hedges, the stone path, a white bench near the trees. How am I supposed to trust memories that arrive because people keep telling me what happened? You don't have to trust them immediately. What if I'm only repeating what I've heard? Then we let time answer. She turned. "You make patience sound easy." "It isn't." Martha stepped inside carrying a wooden box. "There is something Monica left for you." Richard looked at her. "Martha, she should know it exists." Martha placed the box on the desk. 12 envelopes were arranged inside by date. Each carried Annie's name. "She wrote one every year," Richard said. "Birthdays, Christmas, sometimes ordinary days when she missed you." Annie reached toward the first envelope, then stopped. "Did she know she was dying?" "Near the end, yes." "Did she think I was alive?" "Every day." Annie selected the envelope marked for her 18th birthday. Her hands shook as she opened it. "My dear Annie, today you are 18. I do not know where you are, what music you love now, or whether you still put too much sugar in your tea. I know only this. Your worth has never depended on this house, our name, or whether anyone powerful recognizes you. You were precious before the world knew your face, and you remain precious wherever life has carried you." Annie stopped reading. Richard turned away to give her privacy. She continued silently until the final line. "If you ever come home, I hope we remember that home is not the place where questions end. It is the place where truth is allowed to enter." Annie folded the letter and held it against her chest. Richard looked back only when she spoke. She didn't sound angry. She was angry many times. "At me?" "Never." Annie lowered her eyes. "At Margaret? At whoever kept you from us." She did not know who that was. "And at you?" Richard took a moment before answering. "She had reason to be." Annie waited. "After you disappeared, I blamed her. Not with one accusation. I did it through distance. She needed me to grieve beside her, and I gave her investigators, schedules, and reports. You thought work could fix it. Yes. Did you apologize? Not well enough. Annie looked at Monica's letter again. You said you would tell me the parts that make you look bad. I meant it. Then don't protect yourself now. Richard nodded. I won't. She placed the letter back inside its envelope. I'm not ready to read the others. They will remain here until you are. No. Richard looked at her. I want to take them with me. He closed the box and handed it to her without hesitation. Annie held it carefully. A different life rested inside, written year by year by a woman who had never stopped waiting. As she left the room, she paused beside the piano and pressed the first 3 notes once more. This time, they did not feel borrowed. Annie carried Monica's letters downstairs with both hands. Richard walked beside her but did not offer to take the box. By the time they reached the kitchen, Martha had wrapped 2 grilled cheese sandwiches in foil and placed them in a paper bag. For later, she said, people make poor decisions when they skip meals. Annie accepted the bag. Mrs. Jenkins says the same thing. Then Mrs. Jenkins has sense. Daniel entered through the side door with his phone pressed to his ear. His expression told Richard something had changed. What happened? Richard asked. Daniel ended the call. A photographer was outside the gate. Richard's face tightened. How did he know she was here? I'm checking. Annie held the box closer. A photographer? Daniel spoke carefully. Someone took pictures when you arrived. Of me? Yes. Richard reached for his phone. Have security remove him. He's already gone. That means he has what he wanted. Annie looked toward the window. The peaceful lawn now felt exposed. You said there would be no reporters. I didn't invite them. That doesn't change the fact that they found me. No, it doesn't. Daniel's phone rang again. He checked the screen. The first photograph is online. Richard held out his hand. Daniel gave him the phone. The image showed Annie stepping out of the sedan near the side entrance. Her face was clear. Richard appeared behind her, and the caption called her an unidentified young woman visiting the Whitmore estate. Another article appeared less than a minute later. Mystery guest at Billionaire's home may be linked to decade-old family case. Annie read the headline over Richard's shoulder. They know already? They're guessing, Daniel said. They have my picture. Richard handed the phone back. You're leaving through another exit. Annie's eyes narrowed. And then what? We get you home without anyone following. You think cameras won't be waiting there too? Richard did not answer fast enough. Annie set Monica's letters on the counter. This is what happens around you, isn't it? Sometimes, people watch where you go. They photograph who you speak to. Then strangers decide what the story means. Yes, you should have warned me. I should have. She gave a short laugh without humor. You say that often. Because I have been wrong often. That doesn't make this easier. No. Annie looked at Martha. Is there somewhere I can call Mrs. Jenkins? Martha led her to a small office near the kitchen. Annie closed the door and dialed. Mrs. Jenkins answered on the second ring. You all right? Have you seen anyone near the building? A pause followed. There's a news van at the corner. Annie closed her eyes. Already? 2 people asked which apartment was yours. Nobody told them. Thank you. Don't come back until we clear the front steps. It's my home. I know. That's why we're protecting it. Annie heard voices in the background. Who's with you? Mr. Ellis, Reverend Cole, and half the women from the Thursday Bible group. Despite everything, Annie smiled faintly. That sounds dangerous. It is if anyone steps on my flowers. When Annie returned to the kitchen, Richard was issuing instructions to Daniel. No company statement, no confirmation. Contact the building owner and arrange security outside, not inside. Make sure Annie approves anyone assigned. Annie stopped near the table. You're arranging security at my building? I'm trying to keep reporters from blocking the entrance. You didn't ask. Richard closed his mouth. Daniel looked between them and stepped away. Richard turned toward Annie. Would you like security outside your building? I would like people to stop deciding what I need before asking. You're right. She studied him, waiting to see whether he would continue explaining. He did not. After a moment, Annie said, 2 people. Plain clothes. They stay outside. They don't question my neighbors, and they don't follow me. Richard nodded. Agreed. And I choose when they leave. Yes. Daniel recorded the conditions. Annie picked up Monica's letters again. I want to go home. Richard arranged for a different car. Daniel drove while Richard sat beside Annie in the back. No one spoke during the first 10 minutes. Annie checked her phone. Messages had begun arriving from people she barely knew. A former classmate sent a link with 3 question marks. Another asked whether Annie had secretly been rich all along. Then she saw the comments beneath the article. Some people believed she was Richard's daughter. Others called her an opportunist. Several questioned why a black woman selling flowers would have any connection to the Whitmore family. One comment suggested Richard had become confused after his wife's death. Another claimed Annie had probably learned the lullaby from the internet. Annie locked the screen. Richard noticed. Don't read them. That's easy for you to say. No, it isn't. I've read what people wrote about Monica. Annie turned toward him. What did they write? That she married me for money, that she used race to gain sympathy, that she did not fit the image expected of my family. What did you do? Sometimes I defended her. Sometimes I told her to ignore it. Did that help? No. Then don't tell me to ignore it. Richard nodded. You're right. The car stopped 1 block from Annie's building because reporters had gathered near the entrance. Mrs. Jenkins stood on the front steps with her arms folded. Mr. Ellis was beside her, still wearing his veteran's cap. Several neighbors formed a loose line across the walkway. Annie opened the door before Daniel could come around. Richard caught her concern. Do you want me with you? She looked at the cameras, then at the people protecting her home. Yes, she said, but don't speak for me. I won't. They walked together. Questions came from every direction. Miss Carter, are you Richard Whitmore's daughter? Are you seeking part of the Whitmore estate? Why were you brought to his home? Annie kept moving until one reporter stepped too close. Richard shifted between them but said nothing. Annie stopped. My mother died 6 months ago, she said. Yesterday I sold flowers on the street. Today people who have never met me are asking how much money I want. The cameras remained raised. I haven't asked Mr. Whitmore for anything. I am trying to understand my own life. Please let me do that without turning me into entertainment. Mrs. Jenkins opened the door. Annie entered, followed by Richard. Before the door closed, one reporter called out, Mr. Whitmore, is she your daughter? Richard looked at Annie. She gave no permission. He turned back to the reporter. This is her story to tell when she is ready. Inside, Annie placed Monica's letters on the hall table. Her hands were shaking again. But this time she did not feel powerless. Richard had possessed the answer and still allowed her to choose the words. It was not trust yet, but it was the first reason she had found to consider it. By morning, the sidewalk outside Annie's building had become a place people came to watch. 2 news vans remained near the corner. Reporters waited beside their cameras, while neighbors took turns near the entrance. Mrs. Jenkins had placed a folding chair by the front door and sat there with a thermos of coffee. No one gets upstairs unless Annie says so, she told the security guard Richard had arranged. The guard nodded. Yes, ma'am. And don't call me ma'am every time I speak. Yes, Mrs. Jenkins. That's better. Upstairs, Annie sat at the kitchen table reading Monica's 18th birthday letter again. The other envelopes remained inside the wooden box. She had not slept much, and the messages on her phone continued to arrive faster than she could delete them. Richard stood near the window, careful not to step into view. You should go home, Annie said. I will when you ask me to. I just did. He turned. Then I'll go. His immediate agreement surprised her. She closed the letter. You're not going to argue? I'm learning. That must be difficult. It has been. A knock came from the door. Mrs. Jenkins entered carrying scrambled eggs, toast, and a plate of bacon. Food, she announced. Neither of you looks qualified to refuse. Richard took the tray from her. Thank you. Mrs. Jenkins looked at Annie. A woman from Channel 8 says she only wants one question. She can ask it from the sidewalk. That's what I told her. Daniel called Richard a few minutes later. Richard listened without interrupting, then ended the call. My board wants a public statement. Annie pushed her plate away. About me? About the photographs and the test. You told them? No, the laboratory did not release anything either. They're reacting to the rumors. What do they want you to say? That the report is unconfirmed and that you may have approached me because of my family name. Annie's face hardened. They want to make me sound like a liar. They want to protect the company. From me. Yes. Mrs. Jenkins crossed her arms. And what are you going to do about it? Richard answered without looking away from Annie. I'm going to tell them no. Annie studied him. Your company has hotels in half the country. More than half. And you're willing to upset the people who run it? They work for the company. They do not decide how I speak about my family. The word caught Annie's attention. You keep calling me that. Richard paused. Does it bother you? I don't know yet. Then I'll be careful. She looked down at Monica's letter. I want another test. Richard did not react beyond a small nod. At a clinic I choose, she continued. You don't speak to the doctor before I do. You don't receive the result first. Agreed. And I want someone with me who isn't connected to you. Mrs. Jenkins? The older woman pointed toward herself. I have a dentist appointment at 2. Annie almost laughed. I was going to ask Reverend Cole. Good choice, Mrs. Jenkins said. He asks too many questions, but at least they're usually useful. Richard took out his phone. Daniel can send you a list of accredited clinics. No list. I'll find one. He put the phone away. All right. Annie chose a medical center near University City. Reverend Cole agreed to accompany her, and Richard stayed away as promised. By early afternoon, Annie sat in a private consultation office while a nurse explained the process. This is voluntary, the nurse said. You can stop at any point. I understand. The sample is collected with a cheek swab. The report will be sent directly to you. And no one else? Not without your written permission. Annie signed the form. Reverend Cole waited beside her. He was in his late 60s, with a soft voice and a habit of rubbing the edge of his wedding ring while thinking. You don't have to be calm, he told her. I'm not. You look calm. That's different. The nurse collected the sample and sealed it in front of Annie. On the way out, reporters were waiting near the parking lot. Someone had learned where she was. Reverend Cole opened the passenger door for her. A reporter called, Annie, are you taking a second DNA test? She kept walking. Do you plan to claim part of the Whitmore fortune? Annie stopped before entering the car. Reverend Cole spoke quietly. You don't owe them an answer. I know. She turned toward the cameras. I came here because the first test was done without my permission, she said. This one was my choice. That is the only statement I'm making. Another reporter raised his voice. Are you accusing Richard Whitmore of violating your rights? I said he made a decision without asking me. He has apologized. What happens next is between us. Do you believe he's your father? Annie opened the car door. I believe the truth should not require a person to surrender control of her own life. She got in, and Reverend Cole drove away. The clip reached television within an hour. At Whitmore headquarters, Richard watched it from his office with Daniel beside him. She handled that better than our communications team would have, Daniel said. That is not a compliment to the team. It wasn't meant to be. Richard's phone rang again. The chairman of the board spoke before Richard could greet him. This situation is affecting the stock price. My daughter is not a situation. You still don't have an official result. She does. And until she releases it, the company needs distance. Richard looked at Annie's image paused on the television screen. No. You should think carefully. I have spent 10 years thinking about what I failed to protect. I am finished choosing comfort over the people I love. He ended the call. Daniel remained near the desk. They may call an emergency meeting. Let them. That evening, Annie sat with Mrs. Jenkins and watched Richard step before a row of microphones outside Whitmore headquarters. He wore a dark suit, but there were no company logos behind him and no executives at his side. I will make this brief, he began. Annie Carter has asked for privacy, and I intend to respect that. She has requested no money, no property, and no public recognition. The attacks on her character are without basis. A reporter asked whether Annie was his daughter. Richard answered. A preliminary test says yes. She has chosen an independent test, and the result is hers to share. Another voice asked why anyone should believe a street flower seller had a connection to the Whitmore family. Richard's expression changed. Because poverty is not evidence of dishonesty, and wealth is not evidence of virtue. Annie's fingers tightened around Monica's letter. Richard continued. Monica Carter Whitmore was my wife. She was treated unfairly by people who judged her color before they knew her character. I will not watch the same thing happen to Annie. He stepped away without taking further questions. Mrs. Jenkins turned off the television. He did all right. Annie looked at the dark screen. He didn't say I was confused. No. He didn't make me sound grateful. No. He didn't ask me first. Mrs. Jenkins considered that. Would you have given him permission? I don't know. Then maybe he spoke about himself instead of speaking for you. Annie looked down at the unopened envelopes beside her. Her phone rang. The clinic number appeared on the screen. She answered. Miss Carter, the doctor said, your report is ready. Annie gripped the phone. Would you like me to explain the result? Yes. The probability of paternity is 99.9%. Annie closed her eyes. The second test had not changed the truth. It had only placed the choice of what to do with it in her hands. Annie kept the phone against her ear long after the doctor finished explaining the report. Would you like a copy sent by email? The doctor asked. Yes. And a printed copy? Yes, please. Is there anyone you would like us to contact? Annie looked across Mrs. Jenkins's kitchen. Richard's press conference had ended, but his words still occupied the space around her. No, she said. I'll tell him myself. After the call, Mrs. Jenkins set a cup of tea beside her. Well? Annie placed the phone on the table. The same result. Mrs. Jenkins lowered herself into the opposite chair. How do you feel? I don't know. That's allowed. I thought the second test would make everything clear. It made one fact clear, and made the rest worse. Mrs. Jenkins nodded. Facts can open doors. They don't tell you whether you're ready to walk through them. Annie looked toward the wooden box of Monica's letters. The report had confirmed Richard's claim, but it had not told her what to call him, where she should live, or how to carry 10 years of stolen time. She picked up her phone again. Richard answered before the second ring. Annie? The result came. He did not ask what it said. Are you all right? No. I can come to you. She almost said yes, then stopped. Meet me somewhere quiet. Where? The park. There was a pause. Fairmount Park? Yes. I'll be there. Come alone. I will. Annie ended the call before her courage changed. Near sunset, she waited beside a walking path not far from the entrance. The air had cooled, and the trees had begun to lose their leaves. A few people passed with dogs or paper cups of coffee, but no reporters were nearby. Richard approached on foot. He wore no jacket, only a white shirt with the sleeves rolled once at the wrists. He stopped several feet away. You came. You asked me to. Annie held the folded report in one hand. It says you're my father. Richard's face tightened, but he did not smile. Yes, you already knew. I knew what the first test suggested. This one was mine. I understand. She handed him the report. He glanced at the conclusion, then returned it. You can keep it, she said. No, it is yours. Annie folded it again. For a moment, neither of them spoke. A cyclist passed behind Richard, and dry leaves shifted along the path. Annie looked toward the benches near the trees. Is this where I disappeared? Not exactly. Farther north. Can you show me? Richard hesitated. Today? I need to see it. They walked without touching. Richard kept his pace slow enough for Annie to remain beside him. He did not point out every detail or fill the distance with explanations. After several minutes, they reached a play area bordered by trees and a paved path. Annie stopped near an empty bench. Here? Richard nodded. You were near that path. Annie examined the ordinary space. There was no sign marking what had happened. People crossed it without knowing that one family's life had divided there. What was I doing? You were carrying a small red bag. What was in it? Crackers. A juice box. A stuffed rabbit you refused to leave in the car. The one with the blue ear? Yes. Annie lowered her eyes. Did Monica stand here? Near the bench. And then I was gone. Yes. She sat down. Richard remained standing until she moved slightly and left room beside her. You can sit. He did. Annie held the report between both hands. The doctor said the result is reliable. It is. So there's no more maybe? No. She turned toward him. Why aren't you happy? Richard looked across the path. I am. But your answer gave me something I wanted. It may have taken something from you. What? The last place where you could say this was all a mistake. Annie had not found words for that feeling until he named it. You had 10 years to imagine finding me, she said. I had one day to lose my whole life. Richard lowered his head. Then I will not ask you to catch up to my hope. She studied him. Did you practice that? No. It sounded practiced. I've had very little sleep. Despite herself, Annie gave a brief laugh. It faded quickly. I watched your statement. I hope I didn't make things worse. You said Monica was treated unfairly. She was. By strangers? By strangers, business associates, and members of my own circle. And you? Richard did not answer immediately. I defended her when the insults were direct. I failed when the prejudice arrived dressed as advice. What does that mean? People told me she would damage my reputation. They said our marriage would confuse investors. They questioned whether she could represent the family properly. And what did you say? Sometimes I challenged them. Other times I told Monica not to let it affect her. Annie's expression hardened, so she had to carry it quietly because confronting it made you uncomfortable. Yes. Richard's willingness to admit it did not lessen the wrong, but it prevented him from hiding behind good intentions. Why tell me that now? Because you asked for the parts that make me look bad. Annie stared at the path ahead. I don't want a perfect father. I'm relieved. I want the truth. You'll have it, even when it hurts, especially then. She took Monica's 18th birthday letter from her bag. I read this again. Richard recognized the envelope but did not ask to hold it. She wrote that my value didn't depend on your name. She believed that. Do you? Yes. Then don't try to change everything about me. I won't. You say that now, but you solve problems before people finish explaining them. Richard accepted the criticism. Then tell me what not to solve. My apartment, my work, my clothes, the people I speak to, my name. All right. And don't buy a flower company. He looked surprised. I had not planned to. You thought about it. I considered a shop. That's close enough. Richard almost smiled. Point taken. Annie put the letter away. There is something I want from you. Anything. Don't say anything until you hear it. He nodded. I want to visit Monica. Richard's expression changed. Not the house, Annie continued. Her grave. He looked down at his hands. When? Tomorrow. I'll take you. And bring the other letters. They're already with you. Not those. Anything she wrote near the end. Anything you didn't show me. Richard became still. There is one letter, he said. She asked me to keep it until I found you. Then tomorrow you give it to me. Yes. Annie rose from the bench. Richard stood beside her. She looked once more across the place where Annabelle Whitmore had disappeared. Then she faced the man the second test had confirmed as her father. I'm not ready to call you anything different. I know, but I want you to come tomorrow. I'll be there. They walked back toward the entrance as evening settled over the park. Annie still did not know what home meant, but for the first time, she had chosen the next step herself. The next morning, Richard arrived with Monica's final letter inside a plain brown envelope and a small box of white roses on the seat beside him. Annie entered the car without greeting the driver, then noticed the flowers. I arranged them myself, Richard said. Annie glanced at the uneven stems. I can tell. I was hoping you'd say they looked professional. They look sincere. I'll accept that. The cemetery stood beyond the city, where the traffic thinned and the houses gave way to open fields. Richard spoke only when Annie asked about the route. She held Monica's 18th birthday letter in her lap but did not open it. At the entrance, Richard asked the driver to remain near the car. He carried the roses, as he and Annie followed a narrow gravel path between rows of headstones. Annie noticed that he had removed his tie. His suit was simple, and he carried no phone in his hand. Do you come here often? She asked. Every Sunday when I'm in Pennsylvania. You never told me. I didn't want you to think grief was the only thing I had to offer. They continued until Richard stopped beside a gray headstone beneath an old maple tree. Monica Carter Whitmore, beloved wife, mother, and music teacher. Annie read the words twice. Richard placed the roses at the base of the stone, then stepped aside. She liked white roses, he said. Not the expensive arrangements people sent to the house. She liked the ones sold in paper sleeves at grocery stores. Annie touched the edge of one petal. I sell white roses more than anything else. I noticed. Was that why you bought them? At first, I bought them because I needed a reason to stay near you. Then I saw the flowers and thought of her. Annie looked at the headstone. Tell me something ordinary about her. Richard considered the request. She made pancakes every Sunday and always burned the first one. Every Sunday? Every single time. Was she a bad cook? No. She said the first pancake tested the pan. That sounds like an excuse. It was. A small smile came to Annie's face. What else? She sang while grading music papers. She carried peppermints in her purse. She invited hotel staff to Thanksgiving dinner if they had nowhere else to go. One year, we had 23 people at the table, and she insisted everyone say what they were grateful for before eating. Did you like that? I complained every year. But you did it. She made refusing difficult. Annie sat on the bench near the grave. Richard remained standing until she nodded toward the empty space. You can sit. He lowered himself beside her, leaving distance between them. Annie looked at Monica's name again. Did she ever stop hoping? No. Not even near the end? Especially not then. Richard reached inside his coat and removed the brown envelope. She wrote this 3 days before she died. Annie accepted it but did not break the seal. Did you read it? No. She gave it to you without telling you what it said? She said it wasn't written for me. Annie traced Monica's handwriting with one finger. For Annie, when Richard finds her, not if, when. She was certain. She was. Annie opened the envelope. The letter was written across 4 pages. Monica's handwriting began firmly, then became less steady near the end. My dear Annie, your father may be sitting near you when you read this. He may be trying to explain too much because he does that when he is afraid. Ask him to stop. He will listen, although sometimes he needs to be reminded twice. Annie looked sideways at Richard. She knew you well. She did. Annie continued, I have imagined your face at every age. In my mind, you changed with the seasons. Some days you still wore your red coat. Other days, you were older and asking questions I could not answer. I need you to know that none of this was your fault. You were loved before you disappeared. While we searched, and every day after, do not let our name become a weight around your life. Use it if it helps you. Leave it behind if it does not. A name should tell the truth, not demand obedience. Annie paused and wiped her cheek. Richard turned toward the trees to give her privacy. She kept reading, Your father loves you. He will try to repair 10 years in 10 days. Do not let him. Healing has its own pace, and money cannot command it. He made mistakes after we lost you. So did I. Grief can make people hold tightly to the wrong things. I held tightly to hope because it was the only way I knew to keep moving. Please do not spend your life measuring who suffered more. Pain is not a contest. What matters is what people choose after the truth arrives. The final paragraph was shorter. Wherever you have been, whatever name you have carried, you are still the answer to the song your father wrote. I hope that when you hear it again, you will not hear loss. I hope you will hear a door opening. With all my love, Mom. Annie folded the pages along their original creases. She called herself Mom. Richard's voice was low. She never stopped being your mother. And Margaret? She raised you. That isn't what I asked. Richard took time before answering. Margaret cared for you. She also denied you the truth. Both things can be real. Annie looked at Monica's grave. I feel guilty standing here. Why? Because I loved the woman who kept me from her. You did not choose what Margaret did. I still called her Mom. You were told she was. That doesn't change what Monica lost. No, but punishing yourself won't return those years to her. Annie pressed the letter against her chest. Did Monica forgive you? Richard lowered his eyes. I don't know. For blaming her? Yes. Did you ask? Not clearly enough. Why not? Because a real apology would have required me to stop explaining myself. Annie turned toward him. Then do it now. Richard looked at the headstone, his hands closed together between his knees. I was wrong, Monica, he said. You needed a husband, and I acted like a manager. You needed someone to share the loss, and I treated your grief like a problem to organize. I blamed you because I was too afraid to admit I could not protect either of you. His voice broke, but he continued. I'm sorry I made you carry that alone. Annie reached for his hand. Richard held hers carefully. After a while, she placed the remaining white roses beside Monica's name. I wish I remembered her. You may remember more. And if I don't, then I'll tell you every ordinary thing I can. Annie nodded. As they began walking back toward the car, she stopped. There's one more place I need to go. Richard understood before she spoke. Margaret's grave? Yes. He looked back once at Monica's headstone. When you're ready. I'm ready now. Richard did not argue. He opened the car door for her, and Annie carried Monica's letter with her toward the woman whose care had saved her through hard years and whose lie had taken 10 years from everyone else. Margaret Doyle was buried in a small cemetery outside the city, where the markers were simple and the grass grew unevenly between narrow paths. Richard asked the driver to wait near the entrance. Annie carried a bundle of wildflowers she had bought from a roadside stand. They found the grave near a row of pine trees. The headstone held only Margaret's name, the years of her life, and one line beneath them. She gave more than she had. Annie stood before it for a long moment. Richard remained several steps away. "You can come closer," she said. He moved beside her, though his attention stayed on the marker rather than the woman who had taken 10 years from his family. Annie placed the wildflowers against the stone. They were less orderly than Monica's white roses, small yellow blooms mixed with purple asters and green stems. Margaret liked flowers that looked as though no one had arranged them, Annie said. She said gardens should not look nervous. Richard glanced at the bouquet. "That sounds like something Monica might have said." Annie's mouth tightened. "Please don't compare them today." "You're right. I'm sorry." She lowered herself onto the nearby bench. Richard waited until she moved her bag, leaving room beside her. "She made soup when I was sick," Annie said. "Not canned soup. The kind that took all afternoon. She worked at a laundry, then cleaned offices at night. Sometimes she came home so tired she fell asleep at the kitchen table." Richard listened. "She taught me how to count change. She showed me how to tell when flowers were fresh. When the rent went up, she skipped meals and told me she had already eaten." Annie looked toward the grave. "And all that time she knew." "Yes, she knew you were searching. She knew Monica was waiting. She had the newspaper under her bed." Richard's voice remained even. "Yes, I keep trying to decide which version of her was real. Maybe both were." Annie turned toward him. "The woman who cared for you was real," he continued. "So was the woman who chose fear over truth. She was ill. She was. That matters. It explains part of what happened. It does not remove the harm." Annie looked down at her hands. "I'm afraid that if I condemn what she did, I lose every good memory. You don't. And if I defend her, I betray Monica. You don't have to defend Margaret to remember that she cared for you." Annie drew a slow breath. "She loved me. I believe she did. But love should have brought me back." Richard looked toward Margaret's name. "Love without honesty can become another form of control." Annie rose and walked to the grave. "You loved me," she said, her voice steady despite the tears on her face. "But love without truth became another kind of prison." The wind moved through the pine branches. "I'm grateful you fed me. I'm grateful you stayed beside me when I was sick. I'm grateful for every dress you repaired and every morning you got up before sunrise." She paused. "But you had no right to keep my name from me. You had no right to let another woman die while searching for the daughter you knew was alive." Richard lowered his eyes. Annie pressed her fingers to her lips, then continued. "I can miss you and still say you were wrong. I can love you and refuse to carry your lie any longer." She stepped back. Richard approached the marker with a single wildflower from the bouquet. He held it for several seconds before placing it beside the others. "I don't know whether I can forgive you," he said. "You took years that no one can return." Monica died without hearing Annie's voice again. His jaw tightened. "But you kept her alive. You fed her when I could not find her. You gave her enough care to become the woman standing here now." Annie watched him. "That does not settle the debt," Richard added. "It only tells the whole truth." On the drive back to Philadelphia, neither of them spoke for several miles. Annie held Monica's letter in one hand and Margaret's final confession in the other. Two women had shaped her life. One had lost her and continued hoping. The other had found her and refused to let go. By the following week, Annie met with a detective assigned to review the old missing person file. Richard attended only because she asked him to. The detective placed Margaret's letters, the hospital bracelet, the newspaper clipping, and both DNA reports into separate folders. "This is enough to close the original case," he said. "The department will issue a corrected report stating that you were removed from the park and later concealed under another identity." Annie sat across from him. "What happens to Monica's record? Her name will be cleared of any suggestion that she abandoned you or helped arrange the disappearance." Richard's hand tightened around the arm of his chair. Annie noticed but did not comment. The detective continued. You'll also receive assistance restoring your legal documents, birth certificate, social security record, school history, anything affected by the name change. My name is Annie Carter, she said. You can keep it. Richard looked at her. Annie added, I haven't decided about Whitmore. The detective nodded. That decision is yours. Outside the station, reporters waited across the street. Richard asked whether she wanted to use another exit. No, Annie said. I'm tired of leaving through side doors. They walked out together. A reporter called, Miss Carter, has the case been resolved? Annie stopped at the top of the steps. Yes. Do you plan to file a claim against the Whitmore family? No. What do you want now? Annie looked at the cameras, then at the people passing behind them. I want the truth recorded correctly. I want my mother's name cleared. And I want families without money to receive the same effort powerful families expect. Richard did not interrupt. Later that afternoon, he showed Annie a proposal for 2 independent programs. One would support missing person investigations for low-income families. The other would provide mental health care for women facing infertility, loss, and severe grief. Annie read every page. You put your company's name on both. I can remove it. You should. Richard nodded. Done. And an outside board controls the money. Agreed. No advertisements using my face or Monica's. Agreed. Annie closed the folder. You're learning faster. I have a demanding teacher. She almost smiled. Richard gathered the papers, but Annie stopped him. There's one more decision. He waited. I don't want to stay in that apartment forever. Richard's expression changed, though he kept his voice measured. Where would you like to go? I don't know yet. That's enough for today. Annie looked at him with cautious approval. For once, he had not offered a mansion, a contract, or a completed plan. He had simply left the next choice in her hands. 3 days later, Annie invited Richard to her apartment. He arrived with Daniel, but asked him to wait downstairs. Mrs. Jenkins opened her door as Richard reached the landing. She has made up her mind about something, she said. Richard stopped. Did she tell you what? No, and if she wanted me to tell you, she would have said so. You and Martha would get along. I'll decide that when I meet her. Annie was seated at the kitchen table with several sheets of paper arranged in front of her. One listed rental prices. Another contained information about finishing her education. A third showed vacant storefronts in 3 Philadelphia neighborhoods. Richard took the chair across from her. You've been busy. I needed to understand my options before you started offering yours. He nodded. That is fair. Annie slid the first paper toward him. I can't stay here much longer. The landlord is raising the rent again, and reporters still stop people outside. I can find another apartment. You did it already, didn't you? Richard paused. I asked Daniel to research a few places. That means yes. Yes. Annie leaned back. This is what I'm talking about. You hear a problem and begin solving it before I finish the sentence. I wanted to be prepared. For your decision or mine? He looked at the list in front of her. Yours. Then let me make it. Richard folded his hands. All right. Annie explained that she wanted to stay at the estate for several months while finishing her school requirements and finding a permanent home. She would not accept a staff member assigned to watch her, and she wanted control over her schedule. Richard listened without interrupting. I'll pay for my own personal expenses, she continued. You do not have to. I know. That is different from saying I should not. What about tuition? We can discuss it after I know what program I'm entering. He caught himself before making an offer. What would you like from me today? Annie noticed the change. A room that doesn't feel like a memorial. Richard understood. You don't want the old bedroom. I want to visit it when I choose. I don't want to wake up every morning surrounded by a life I can barely remember. I'll have another room prepared. Don't have it decorated before I arrive. He almost asked why, then stopped. You want to choose? Yes. They reviewed the remaining papers. Annie planned to complete her high school equivalency requirements, then study business and music through a local college program. She also wanted to work several days each week. At one of the hotels? Richard asked. No. The company has training positions. I spent years learning how people speak to someone selling flowers on a sidewalk. I don't want my first job after moving into your house to come from your last name. Richard accepted the answer. What kind of work? A flower shop. A real one. I need to learn ordering, bookkeeping, event contracts, and how to keep inventory from becoming waste. I know several owners. Give me their names. I'll contact them. He smiled. That was going to be my suggestion. No, it wasn't. No, he admitted. I was going to call them myself. Annie gathered the papers into a folder. You're improving, but not quickly. I've had 50 years of practice doing things my way. That is not a defense. I know. Before Richard left, Annie handed him a legal form. He read the name typed across the top. Annie Carter Whitmore. His eyes lifted. I'm not giving up Carter, she said. It was Monica's name before she married you. It is also the name I have used for most of my life. You do not owe me an explanation. I'm not explaining. I'm telling you. Richard read the name again. It suits you. It is mine. Yes. The following week, Annie moved into the estate with 2 suitcases, Monica's letters, Margaret's box, and the woven basket she had once carried through the city. Richard had offered a moving truck. Annie reminded him that everything she owned fit into Daniel's car. Martha met her at the side entrance. Welcome, Miss Carter Whitmore. Annie is fine. Martha took 1 suitcase. I know. Good manners cost nothing. The room Annie chose faced the garden but contained little more than a bed, a desk, and a dresser. She selected blue curtains from a neighborhood store and placed fresh daisies in a glass jar near the window. Richard appeared at the open door. Would you like anything else? A lock. His expression changed. For the door? Yes. This house is secure. That wasn't the question. Richard called the maintenance manager and had a lock installed that afternoon. He gave Annie both keys. One evening, she found him in the kitchen studying a folder. What is that? A list of flower shops for sale. Annie took the folder from him. We discussed this. I was only researching. You were planning to buy one. I was considering an investment. You were considering handing me a finished life. Richard closed the folder. What would be better? A small shop I build myself. With what financing? Alwan, from a bank? Or from you, if the terms are real? Richard frowned. You want me to charge you interest? I want paperwork. I want monthly payments. I want both of us to understand that help does not mean control. He considered her words. Daniel can prepare an agreement. An independent attorney prepares it. Richard gave a short nod. You really have thought this through. I had to. People with less money learn early that gifts often come with instructions. The statement stayed with him. Over the next months, Annie completed her required classes, worked part-time at a family-owned florist, and learned to manage suppliers, invoices, and difficult customers. She returned to the estate each evening tired but satisfied. Richard stopped asking whether she needed him to fix things. Instead, he learned another question. Would you like help? Sometimes Annie said yes. Often she said no. He treated both answers with equal respect. Together, they found a vacant storefront near Fairmount Park. It needed paint, wiring, and patience. Annie walked through it twice before making her decision. There should be a piano near the back, she said, and a bulletin board for community notices. Richard looked around. What will you call it? Annie held one of Monica's letters in her hand. Monica's Garden. Richard lowered his eyes for a moment. That is a good name. Annie looked toward the front window, imagining white roses where dust now gathered along the glass. For the first time, the future did not feel like something that had been returned to her. It felt like something she was choosing. 1 year after Annie first sat beside 2 baskets of flowers on a Philadelphia sidewalk, Monica's Garden opened its doors. The storefront near Fairmount Park had changed without losing the character Annie liked when she first saw it. The brick exterior had been cleaned, the front windows repaired, and a dark green sign hung above the entrance. White letters carried the name Annie had chosen. Monica's Garden. Fresh flowers filled wooden shelves along the walls. White roses stood near the front window, while daisies, carnations, and seasonal branches occupied large metal buckets farther inside. Prices were written clearly on small cards. Annie wanted anyone passing the store to know that beauty did not have to be reserved for people with large bank accounts. A community bulletin board near the counter held notices for neighborhood meetings, part-time jobs, church dinners, and free music lessons. At the rear of the shop stood an upright piano Richard had restored instead of replacing. Annie had insisted on keeping every mark that did not affect the sound. It has a history, she had told him. So do most things worth keeping, he had replied. By 10 in the morning, the store was crowded. Mrs. Jenkins arrived first, carrying a pan of baked macaroni covered in foil. "This is for later," she said. Opening day excitement is not a meal. Annie accepted it. Martha brought enough food for 30 people. "Martha has not tasted my macaroni." Martha entered behind her with a tray of sandwiches. "I have now heard that challenge twice." Mrs. Jenkins gave her a measured look. "You must be Martha, and you must be the woman who questioned Richard on the front steps." Someone had to. Martha offered her hand. "We are going to get along." Daniel arranged extra chairs near the piano while Mr. Ellis stood by the entrance wearing the same veteran's cap Annie remembered from her street-selling days. He purchased a white rose for his wife and refused the opening day discount. "A fair price keeps a good business open," he said. Annie wrapped the stem in brown paper. 43 years now? 3 years and 6 months. You count the months? My wife does. Several teenagers from the neighborhood worked their first shifts that morning. Annie had hired them to prepare bouquets, record inventory, and assist customers. She corrected mistakes without embarrassing anyone, and reminded them that every person entering the shop deserved the same greeting, whether they wore a business suit or carried loose change. "People remember how you make them feel when they have little money," she told them. "Treat respect like it costs nothing, because it should." Reporters remained outside, but they respected the marked area Daniel had arranged beyond the entrance. Annie had agreed to a few photographs of the store. She had refused interviews about the Whitmore fortune. The shop was not a story about a billionaire giving his daughter a business. The loan papers were real. Annie made monthly payments. She selected the suppliers, approved the renovation costs, and hired the staff herself. Richard gave advice only when asked, though he still had difficulty resisting. Near noon, Annie noticed him across the street. He stood beside a parked car, holding a small paper bag and watching people enter the store. He had chosen not to come inside while cameras remained near the door. Annie stepped onto the sidewalk. "Are you planning to stay over there all day?" Richard looked toward the reporters. "I didn't want today to become about me." "It isn't. I thought my presence might change that." Annie folded her arms. "Dad, are you going to stand out there all day?" Richard did not move. Traffic continued between them. A bus stopped at the corner, and several passengers stepped onto the sidewalk. Richard seemed to have forgotten all of it. Annie's expression softened. "Come inside. You're blocking the customers." He crossed the street slowly. When he reached her, he did not make a speech or ask whether she had meant to use the word. He simply handed her the paper bag. "What is this?" "Lunch." She looked inside and found a grilled cheese sandwich, apple slices, and a small container of tomato soup. "Did Martha pack this?" "I did." Annie raised an eyebrow. "You added cinnamon?" "A little. Then I'll take the risk." Richard followed her into the store. The afternoon brought more customers than Annie had expected. A local teacher ordered flowers for a retirement dinner. A man purchased carnations for his sister. An older woman chose daisies for her kitchen and told Annie that Monica had once taught music at her church. "She never let anyone sit alone after service," the woman said. "Your mother paid attention to people. Others passed by." Annie wrapped the flowers carefully. "Thank you for telling me." Every ordinary story gave Monica another place in Annie's life. Near closing time, Richard helped carry empty buckets to the back. Annie did not remind him that his suit was too expensive for the work. He had stopped treating physical tasks as performances, and she had stopped questioning every offer of help. When the final customer left, Mrs. Jenkins, Martha, Daniel, and the others gathered their containers and coats. Martha kissed Annie's cheek. "Your mother would have loved this place." Annie looked around the shop. "I hope so." She would have corrected the piano placement. "Why?" Monica believed every piano should face the room. Annie glanced toward Richard. He said the opposite. Richard lifted both hands. "I was trying to protect the finish from sunlight." Martha shook her head. "Some habits survive every lesson." After everyone left, Annie locked the door and turned the sign to closed. Her feet hurt. For a moment, she was again the tired flower seller searching for a place to rest. She sat near the front window, loosened her shoes, and watched the evening traffic pass beyond the glass. Then she began to hum. The melody rose without words, carrying the sadness she had once been unable to name. This time, it carried something else as well. Monica's letters, Margaret's confession, Richard's patience, and every choice Annie had made after learning the truth. Richard heard the first notes from the back of the store. He went to the piano and sat down. He waited until Annie reached the second phrase before adding the soft accompaniment. She looked over her shoulder but did not stop. Together, they moved toward the final passage. Annie allowed the high note to rise without force. It came clear and steady. Richard finished the final chord and smiled. "You finally sang it higher than me." Annie walked toward the piano. "I told you I would." Outside, white roses reflected in the shop window as Philadelphia continued around them. For 10 years, Richard had searched files, stations, streets, and thousands of faces. In the end, the melody he had placed in Annie's memory had guided him to her. Blood had answered one question. Truth, patience, and the courage to listen had taught them how to become a family. This story reminds us that love cannot be separated from truth, respect, and responsibility. Blood may reveal a family connection, but trust must still be earned through patience and honest actions. It also shows that wealth does not determine a person's value, and hardship does not erase dignity. Real justice begins when people admit the harm that was done, protect the vulnerable, and give them the freedom to choose their own future. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only,